Hostilities have broken out in Eastern Europe as Russia has begun a quote-unquote special military operation in Ukraine. Russian forces have invaded from all sides, including from Belarus and Crimea. The conflict traces its origins back to the 2013 Euromaidan protests, which gave way to the Revolution of Dignity the next year. This revolution saw the ousting of pro-Russian President Yanukovych, who was forced out of power by Western-aligned protests and riots. Taking advantage of the confusion and fearful of what a Western-oriented Ukraine may mean for the strategic security of the Russian state, Russian forces occupied and annexed the Crimean Peninsula. The revolution also saw the pro-Russian breakaway republics of Donetsk and Luhansk declare their independence, thus starting the protracted Donbass War. Unable to secure its territorial integrity, Ukraine's hopes of joining either the EU or NATO were pointedly crushed. Countries unable to exercise full control of their territory are strategic liabilities that neither NATO nor the EU want to be responsible for. The situation in Ukraine has been stable since these events transpired 8 years ago. That is, until last week. Perhaps sensing the relative weakness of NATO to further intervene in Ukraine, or for reasons not yet known, Putin has ordered an invasion of the country from all angles. Citing a litany of grievances ranging from the fears of NATO enlargement to the alleged genocide of ethnic Russians, Putin has ordered Russian forces massed on the border to invade and quote-unquote denazify the country. Several key cities are under siege, including the capital of Kiev. NATO and the wider international community have responded with condemnation and sanctions that have devastated a Russian economy that was already struggling. Several NATO countries have also promised to supply the Ukrainians with weapons and munitions, a move that runs directly contrary to Putin's demand that no external actors involve themselves in the conflict. But despite the sanctions and promises for lethal aid, NATO is unwilling to directly intervene in the conflict. Key NATO partners such as Germany have refused to stop buying Russian energy exports, despite insistence from Washington. These two factors, as well as the geographic composition of the country, all but guarantee that the special military operation that Russia is conducting in Ukraine will be a success. However valiant the Ukrainians may resist, the geopolitical reality is that Ukraine is a strategic salient untenable for NATO to maintain or protect at this point. As a result, a new geopolitical order will be established in Eastern Europe. If it wasn't already, the unipolar moment that began in 1991 is dead, with Moscow reasserting itself in its sphere of influence in areas once dominated by its imperial and Soviet past. The question is, what exactly do the Russians want from this invasion? Repeated ad nauseum is the Russian position that a Ukrainian accession into NATO is simply unacceptable. The perceived existential security risk that NATO would pose to Russia if it were to expand into Ukraine cannot be underemphasized. With its salient-like borders, Ukraine, coupled with NATO presence in the Baltic states, would essentially mean the wholesale encirclement of Russia by the Atlanticist alliance. Whereas Russia is able to rely on Kaliningrad and its union state with Belarus as a counterweight to NATO and the Baltic states, there exists no such equivalent on the Russia's southwestern flank, which is flat and can be easily traversed by an invading force. With these geopolitical realities in mind, it is likely that the Russian military operations will result in some form of regime change in Kiev. How this is exactly carried out remains to be seen, but Russian policy and security officials clearly feel that Ukraine must be secured from further flirtations with the West. But this answers only half of the Ukrainian question. Achieving regime change satisfies Russia's security concerns, but how far it takes the occupation of Ukraine will be indicative of its broader strategic aims for both Europe and its implications for the Atlanticist paradigm. In short, regime change should be expected. The uncertainty lies in just how much Russia intends to challenge and disrupt the current balance of power on the continent. Toward these ends, Russia has two options for its occupation of Ukraine. The first of these options is the establishment of a buffer territory between NATO and Russia within the territory once controlled by Ukraine. After having achieved their goal of regime change and coinciding with the demilitarization of Ukrainian territory, the Kremlin will seek de-escalation with the Ukrainians and their Western supporters. The remaining territory not occupied by the Russians will be, at least de facto, reorganized around Lviv and the surrounding territories as a buffer space separating NATO from the Russian-occupied Ukraine. Dominated by Ruthenians and Ukrainians, Russian policy and security officials would seek security guarantees from NATO that this border state does not retain claims to the territory formerly held by Ukraine, and more importantly, that it will not seek alignment with the West within the NATO alliance. The creation of such a state would satisfy Russian desires to neutralize the threat further NATO encroachment would have on Russian security policy, while at the same time signaling to the West that the Russian war aims are in fact based on the fear of unrestricted NATO enlargement. More importantly, this rump state would separate the most vulnerable of geopolitical positions, that being the entrance to the Great European Plain. This buffer territory would reduce the likelihood of direct altercation between NATO and Russia, who would otherwise share a huge, open frontier with one another. The demarcation of where Russian-occupied Ukraine and this new state would exist is undetermined, perhaps reflecting the ethno-linguistic composition of the Ukraine. But it can be reasonably expected that Russia will occupy at least all Ukrainian territory east of the Dnieper. Of the two possible outcomes, this is the preferred option if a lasting peace is to be secured on the continent. Though devastating to Ukraine itself, A mutual recognition of spheres of influence separated by a neutral area can incentivize both sides to pursue diplomatic channels over military solutions. The other, more aggressive option for the Kremlin can be aptly called the maximalist position, that being an attempted wholesale occupation of all Ukrainian territory. Rather than anchoring themselves on the Dnieper, the Kremlin would push toward the Carpatho-Bug frontier, a frontier well known to both Imperial and Soviet Russia. Whether through federalization of the territory or by contractual union state status like Belarus, the Kremlin will attempt to subjugate the entirety of Ukraine, whereas the buffer state option simply addresses Russia's primary concerns surrounding the strategic salient Ukraine offers to NATO. The maximalist option is a forthrightly expansionist orientation of Russian designs on Eastern Europe. Ukraine is roughly the length of the American South, and its borders and frontiers reflect this expansive size. Occupying Ukraine would bring Russian influence right into the heart of Central Europe and in the Balkans. Starting in the north, Russia, by way of Kaliningrad and Belarus, would share a huge border with Poland, creating a security dilemma for the country which houses several critical NATO facilities and bases. Even more significant would be the status of Zakarpatska Oblast, the westernmost administrative sector of Ukraine. If the Russians were to occupy this territory, it would place them within striking distance of NATO allies Hungary and Slovakia. The geographic nature of Zakarpatska would give the Russians a foothold within the Pannonian Basin, a position that would all but guarantee Russian influence and power projection in Hungary and Transylvania. Finally, the occupation of Chernivtsi and Odessa Oblast would create a large frontier with Romania, which acts as the keystone for NATO's strategic planning in the Balkans. Positioned as the gatekeeper of the Danube, and with little to no geographic features separating Bucharest from Russian-occupied Ukraine, Romania would be rendered totally exposed should Russia pursue this push into the Carpathians. In short, a maximalist partition of Ukraine by Russia would threaten NATO on three strategic sectors, all of which play a crucial role in the composition and orientation of the alliance as a means by which Russia could be further contained. The maximalist position is, barring outright confrontation with Russia, NATO's worst-case scenario for the partition of Ukraine. While such an endeavor would minimize the likelihood of a Western-backed Ukrainian pretender state with claims on Russian-occupied territory, Moscow would essentially be committing itself to a second Cold War with the West. NATO may be prompted to occupy certain key territories such as Zakarpatska, if for no other reason than to secure its position in the Pannonian Basin from further degradation at the hands of Russian agitation and influence. The loss of the strategic salient that Ukraine provided and the subsequent expansion of Russian frontiers will, at the very least, cause NATO allies such as Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia to reevaluate their geopolitical orientations. Not long ago, these countries were part of the Warsaw Pact, and it was only recently that they fell out of the orbit of Moscow's influence. A Ukraine dominated by Russian military power would necessitate a reassessment of priorities and strategies, as Russian military power would now return to their borders for the first time in over 30 years. Obviously, the conflict is still ongoing, and its conclusion may not bear any resemblance to the ideas or concepts discussed in this video. However, what is certain is that Russia is no longer satisfied with the post-Cold War order of Europe. Russia is making forays into regions it once dominated with increasing confidence, actions that should not be taken lightly if one has an understanding of Russian history and its wide-reaching influence, especially within the context of Eurasia. If NATO wishes to live up to its goal of containing Russia, it must recognize that Russia, being a nuclear power and a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, is entitled to its own sphere of influence just as much as any other great power. If Washington and its allies are unable to come to terms with the new reality of multipolarity, the partition of Ukraine may not just be the only change to the map of Europe in the coming years.